Thanks for joining us on this Friday. We're going to be talking about interventions for children's executive functioning. So before we dive in, just a couple like little disclaimers we like to do, risk statements. Minimal risk, just be careful when using new techniques or interventions and seek appropriate consultation and supervision when needed, and make sure we're practicing within the bounds of our legal and ethical obligations. We don't have any conflicts of interest. Our agenda today is as follows. We're going to be diving into some definitions, various research-based interventions, and we have some specific types of treatments and interventions and strategies to go over with you guys today. I'm Dr. Laura Rowley. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist here at UCEBT. I direct our assessment and testing program, and so work a lot with diagnosing ADHD and developing interventions for children and adults. And I'll turn it over to my co-presenter to introduce herself.
Sweet. I'm Jessie Johnston. I'm a postdoctoral psychology resident at UCBT, and I also work a lot with kids and adolescents with ADHD and do testing as well. Sweet. So today we're going to talk about executive functioning interventions. Before we get into that, we'll define what executive functioning is and go through those executive function abilities. So executive functions are higher order cognitive processes that help us to manage our thoughts, actions, and behaviors. These functions are responsible for initiating, adapting, regulating, monitoring, and controlling information processes. So basically, executive functions act as the brain's control center. So they allow us to plan and focus and remember instructions. Research agrees that there's three core executive function abilities. So those are working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. And all of these are important for goal-directed behavior. So they play a crucial role in like daily functioning, so like social and emotional outcomes as well. So the first of these is inhibition. So this is defined as the ability to withhold dominant automatic behaviors that are irrelevant for the task at hand. So there's two main types of inhibition. So there's cognitive inhibition, which is like the ability to filter out distractions or unwanted thoughts. So if you're like in a work meeting and you see like a hot air balloon out the window, the ability to like focus in on the meeting and stay with those thoughts would be cognitive inhibition. And then behavioral inhibition, on the other hand, is about controlling impulsive actions. So that's like fighting off the urge to like bite your nails or to stop yourself from cutting in line. And then this is the first core executive function ability to develop. So it's thought to stabilize in the early elementary school years. The next is working memory. So this involves holding information in mind and mentally working with it. So relating one thing to another or using information to solve a problem. So this one continues to develop throughout childhood and typically matures by like late adolescence. And then there's also two types of working memory. So there's verbal working memory, which helps us retain and manipulate spoken or written information. So that would be like solving a mental math problem or taking notes. And then there's nonverbal or visual spatial working memory. So that allows us to hold and work with visual or spatial information in our mind. So like if you were to follow like a pattern to build a Lego set, that would be visual spatial. And then the last one is cognitive flexibility. So this is our ability to shift our attention and to focus when there's two stimuli competing for our attention. So this allows us to concentrate on what's needed to complete tasks. And this is the last of the core EF abilities to develop fully. So this one matures in like late adolescence or early adulthood. And we use this in like everyday situations. So when you're adapting to changing plans or switching between languages or topics in a conversation, and then problem solving in the moment. Sweet. So for this presentation, we focused mostly on children and adolescents with ADHD. We chose this population because ADHD is associated with deficits in core executive function abilities. So ADHD includes both inattentive and hyperactive components, which manifest both in behavioral and cognitive ways across EF abilities. So an example would be like being easily distracted is an inattentive symptom, and blurting answers is a hyperactive symptom, and both are related to cognitive and behavioral aspects of inhibition.
Great. Yeah, and I think we chose ADHD in particular, one, because when you are thinking about intervening with executive function, we need to have deficits in executive function, and that's a very clear population where there are some deficits. And also, just for the sake of having a pretty streamlined way to navigate all of the research on this. It's very in depth, it's very complex. There's a lot of things included in this. So, just for the sake of diving into the specific population made the most sense. And so we're going to start out going through different either like strategies, interventions, treatments that have a more limited to no evidence base. And the reason we're starting here is because they often are ones that can be pretty popular and pretty promoted in the media or word of mouth or things we might gravitate to. And it's not to say that these are strategies that are not helpful in some way, and they can be very useful for other specific skills. Um, so that's just something to keep in mind too, is we're not necessarily all of these saying all of these things are like bad or you shouldn't do them either. So we'll just talk through what the actual research says. Um, so First, some assumptions. If we are, if performance on executive function tasks, so the way that we measure in a lab, if we have high working memory and high inhibition and high cognitive flexibility, oftentimes these are correlated with really meaningful outcomes that we want to see, like reduced symptoms of ADHD. So, not as much inattentiveness, not as much hyperactivity, or things like higher academic achievement, which oftentimes when we're talking about executive function interventions, that's a prominent outcome that parents or students or providers are really aiming for. Like that's maybe the main reason they are seeking these types of interventions. And so if they're correlated, then it would stand to reason if we directly train these executive function skills, we directly target working memory, inhibition, flexibility, we should see improved outcomes. We should see better achievement. We should see reduction in symptoms. However, that's not necessarily what the research indicates. And what do we mean by that? So, what is an evidence based executive function intervention? It means that across many studies, usually in a meta analysis or just more broadly, there's cause. Like we can prove that if we directly target this, it causes the improvements in those core EF skills. And we were really searching for things that showed improvement in functioning for kids with ADHD, whether that's improved behaviors or symptoms or academics, whatever. But ultimately, we need to see the cause. The problems with a lot of research on executive function interventions is that these skills or abilities may improve over the course of whatever intervention it is, but the cause is unclear. Or these abilities may improve themselves, like the way that they're measured in the study, but it doesn't lead to some like meaningful outcomes or improvements in functioning. So, like changes in symptoms or academic achievement. So, most commonly, what some third variable or like other factor that might be contributing to the improvement is just like time in general. So kids develop these abilities develop at different times. So as Jesse kind of commented in the definitions of like there's these different age ranges where we kind of see these skills manifest, and sometimes it's just over time. We have regression to the mean. So in some meta-analyses, like the one cited below, um, there are effects that happen when if the children's skills and working memory say were already like very low, they showed the most improvement, but that could just be a nature of like, yeah, when you measure it multiple times, it's going to get closer to the average for things that are like more outliers. Um, Motivation affects outcomes, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the interventions. Practice effects are also a really big one. So when we get to talking about more like cognitive training, if you are specifically training kids to do these tasks and then testing them on those specific tasks, then yes, they are going to get better at those specific tasks. But does that mean you actually developed that core skill? And does that lead to long-term change? Not necessarily. And then cultural context affects the way that these skills are developed as well. So we might see, for example, in some of these studies, kids that have higher socioeconomic advantages do better than kids with lower socioeconomic advantages on like lab-based tasks. But if you make the task more contextually relevant, like show them um, certain images that are more relevant to things in their life or skills that are more relevant to things they do day to day, that difference is less apparent. So it also depends on like how you're measuring it as well and how relevant it is to the cultural context. And so we'll also try to note that as much as possible when we reference these studies of like who was the population that was assessed. I will say, spoiler alert, it tends to be like white, mid to high SES males. So that's going to be a lot of the research. So that's obviously a significant limitation as well when we're trying to make more meaningful, effective interventions for everyone. But we'll note when there's like other populations to consider as well. So this meta-analysis, I think a big statement that I think just captures the limits in research supported intervention is that if you train executive functions, you can improve performance on that task used for training, but it rarely generalizes outside of that. So they might have like technical research support, but like support for what? Or like what are they actually improving? And I say that because one of the interventions that some of the interventions we're looking at might be surprising, I guess, in terms of its limited evidence base or claims that they make. So, coaching is one that doesn't have a ton of evidence base. One, because what even is it? Is a question. um, it's not very well defined, like what counts as coaching or not, or what are the components of it, and who does it. There's no specific credentials or qualifications, and so anyone could be a coach technically, and therefore some of these more in-depth psychological underpinnings might be missed. Um, and it may not really lead to long-term change or like generalizable skills. Like it can be good for very like specific like day-to-day, like I want to develop a morning routine that will kind of like make my life easier, or I want to have an organization system for my work or backpack or computer, right? Like there's like very specific small scope things it can be helpful for, but that doesn't necessarily lead to skills or change in the ability itself. And there could be context that can be helpful for as well. It can be very individualized to what the person needs. So I guess the flip side of lack of standardization is it is highly customizable when highly individualized. And there might be reasons why we would recommend coaching in terms of like access as well. So, for example, some people that we've worked with might not have like a consistent place that they live, or you might be a college student out of state. And so therapy licensure laws would impact access to that, or you travel more internationally, or the family moves around internationally. And so accessibility to the intervention is then much harder for things that are more controlled or regulated. Um, so there might be reasons why is used in that way for skilled license providers to provide that kind of service, or skilled license providers provide this kind of service because that is what they want to focus on. Like, if it's not an in-depth therapy intervention, we do want to have this more targeted, time limited type of intervention, but it can still be grounded in evidence base. It's just much harder to measure. So we're not saying that coaching is never helpful. We're not saying not to use it. We're saying that you have to be very, very careful about one, who is doing the coaching, and two, what claims or outcomes it's making. Like, there's a lot of executive function coaching and training that Jesse will also get into down the line that make these wide sweeping claims of like improvement in grades and academic achievement. And there is just no evidence base for that claim. So just more so being mindful of what it is that you're trying to work on and who you're working with. So that's what we know about coaching. So, school and classroom based interventions. So, first of all, I just want to say kids with ADHD very much benefit from having a 504 or an IEP. So, we're definitely not claiming that they should not have that at all. What we are saying is that one, it's more geared towards accommodation. So things like having extra time, or having tests in a alternate environment, or having breaks, or having fidgets, right? Like, these things are like helpful for the child or the teen to be able to engage and complete academic expectations, but they're not, again, going to directly target those executive function skills. It's more about accommodating them. There is improvement in academic performance when we target learning disabilities that are often maybe co-occurring with ADHD. So if we're needing more reading intervention or more math intervention, right, that's going to be helpful because they need that. But again, we're not necessarily seeing changes in executive function abilities or ADHD symptoms from some of these school-based interventions, at least not consistently, or there just needs to be more research done in that setting with more specific interventions. So that's kind of what we mean by limited evidence base. But again, we would recommend it as like a complement to other interventions. We would recommend it for accommodation. We would recommend it to support kids in school. It's just not going to target executive function specifically. And then there's many other interventions out there that kind of fall under this category of functional medicine. Acupuncture, homeopathy, or things like essential oils, hypnotherapy. Those have been studied in kids around elementary through teen age. Um, and it doesn't really consistently show effects. But again, if you find it helpful, or if families find it helpful, then sure, you can do it. But just be mindful about the claims that it makes, and be mindful that anecdotal evidence is not evidence based either. Yeah, it's just when you look in the research, it's not really there.
All right, so now we got to executive function strategies with mixed results. So what we mean by mixed results is that these approaches or interventions often lack like the standardization or consistency. Like, there's just not enough research yet to say that they're fully effective. But like Laura was saying, like, that doesn't mean that they're not always effective or that they couldn't be helpful when combined with other interventions. Um, so the first one I'll go over is nutrition. So we looked at a meta-analysis of 39 different studies, and they looked at really highly diverse nutrition interventions. So what that means is they looked at like different vitamins and supplements and omega-3s and diets. So there really was no consistency throughout. However, it was shown to be effective at improving ADHD symptoms, but there was no specific supplement or intervention that was consistently shown to improve outcomes. So as a whole, it did, but then when you try to break it down, there wasn't really any that were consistent. Other studies have shown that omega-3s and vitamin D are low in individuals with ADHD or executive functioning deficits. So that's other diagnoses like bipolar or schizophrenia. With children with ADHD, some studies have shown that omega-3s are helpful. Um, However, that really depends. So if the kid is already low in it, adding it can be helpful, but if they're already at a typical level, it doesn't really do anything. And then another one that seems to be pretty big in the media right now is artificial food coloring. When you try to cut that out, it was not clinically significant in reducing ADHD symptoms or improving executive function abilities. So that one doesn't show any evidence.
Yeah, and then there are a lot of common therapy modalities that are used for ADHD. First off, cognitive behavioral therapy is a very solid evidence-based treatment. So again, we're not saying it doesn't have evidence base. Um, it's very helpful for things like anxiety and depression and some behavior change. But when we look at does CBT in and of itself treat ADHD symptoms effectively? Not always. Does ADHD affect executive function? Kind of, not really. So cognitive behavioral therapy addresses, how thoughts and emotions and behaviors are connected and tries to look at learned patterns of behavior and find ways to shift them and lead to more effective goal-directed behavior. So the way this might show up for kids with ADHD is more so the associated maybe emotional challenges that come with struggles with ADHD. So if we look at our classic cognitive triangle, you might help them observe, like, if they seem outwardly like unmotivated and not focused and not trying hard on a task, underneath that, it could just be they observe it takes them so much longer than other people to complete this task. They have thoughts that they're stupid and judgments that they're stupid. They feel really stressed. They feel frustrated and they don't have an effective way of coping with that. And therefore, that's what's more driving the behavior or exacerbating the struggle. And so there's things you can do to intervene around that. And that can be very helpful and very effective, but it's not going to get at the core deficits, essentially. That's, why are they struggling so much? There's other types of interventions that are going to need to be helpful there. So, another strategy that's often used is behavior management or parent training or parent management or parent-child interaction, right? There's like many iterations of this concept, which is just operant conditioning, reinforcing behaviors you want to see more of and either not reinforcing or having negative consequences for behaviors that you don't want to see. So they also involve an important relationship component of if you improve parent-child interactions, it could lead to effective behavior change, which is true. Um, and it also, so there's like an emotional component as well. But the reasons why these methods are so mixed is that one, medication is an important third variable in all of this. So, in meta analyses with cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, um, they showed that the effect was mostly present if it was also paired with medication or like stimulant medication for ADHD. So again, that calls into question of like how much was it the intervention itself, or sometimes in meta-analyses when they looked through these studies with cognitive behavioral therapy or parent training, sometimes the studies didn't even report consistently whether or not the kids were on medication. So we just don't know half the time whether that's included or measured or addressed in these types of studies. Um, so that's something to consider as well. So if we do pair meds with these, we do see more improvement in the ADHD symptoms. Other things that tend to be another variable is that the parent involvement or the parent training tends to be helpful if there are a strong focus on emotional regulation skills and emotional communication skills. And if we train parents to be consistent in their response and they directly practice the skills with their kids during sessions, so having a more like behavioral, like experiential and application component tends to increase effectiveness as well. Um, that tends to increase the amount that it could directly target these ADHD symptoms or behaviors. But again, it just is really dependent as well on the goals. And it's really dependent on what are parents reinforcing. So oftentimes the goals might be more outcome based rather than effort based, meaning like if you want kids to get better grades, you could reward them for higher grades, or you can reward them for time spent studying, and that could lead to better grades. And that would also have the benefit of rewarding executive function skills, which is like, persisting through difficult tasks and putting effort in things that we don't necessarily want to do and inhibiting impulsive responding, right? So, like, if you reward effort, that tends to more directly translate to improved executive function skills. Whereas if you reward outcome, it may or may not. And it may or may not be effective, right? So that's a couple things to keep in mind with these types of interventions. So you still can do them, you still can be very helpful, but if the goal is to improve ADHD symptoms, you need to keep those principles in mind. So effort over outcome, emotional regulation skills, and direct practice in session as much as possible.
All right, sweet. So now we'll talk about cognitive training. So that's a type of game-based training. So basically kids log on and to a computer and there's like different games or tasks that they have to complete. One of the main ones that people usually know about is CogMed. Um, Studies have shown that kids typically increase on working memory abilities, but less so on inhibition and cognitive flexibility. Um, and there's also not a lot of real life functional impairments that are improved. So, like daily functioning or social or academic improvements are not usually common with cognitive training. Another thing to consider too with this is the developmental age. So cognitive flexibility is going to be the hardest one to increase because it's the most complex of the three and takes the longest to develop. When cognitive training is paired with like neurofeedback or biofeedback, results have shown to be greater in improving core executive functioning abilities and symptoms in ADHD as well. So now we'll get into biofeedback. So biofeedback uses operant conditioning, so basically using rewards or punishments to change behavior. And they use these to control certain bodily functions, such as like heart rate or breathing. And you're connected to sensors, and these sensors send real-time information about the bodily functions, usually to like a computer screen. There's a few different types of biofeedback. So there's electrocardiography or ECG. This one measures heart rate. There's electromyography or EMG that measures muscle tension. Neurofeedback, which is the most common, measures brainwave activity. And then there's thermal feedback, which measures skin temperature. And all of these use sensors, and usually they are visually or auditorily, the way that the sensors are giving information to the patient about what's going on. So visually would be like if you saw changing graphics on a screen, whereas auditorily would be like music or tone changes. But there can also be like haptic changes, which are vibrations through a wearable device, or virtual reality, which can also be pretty cool for kids with ADHD because it's more engaging and interactive. You can go to the next slide. So the next one is neurofeedback. So like I said, neurofeedback is a type of biofeedback, and it uses EEG. On occasion, it uses fMRI, where patients learn to modulate their brain activity in real time through visual or auditory signals usually. And then the main goal of this is to train kids with ADHD to engage in self-regulation. So studies have shown that kids with ADHD often have decreased beta activity, which is linked to attention and alertness, and increased theta activity, which is associated with decreased alertness. So neurofeedback aims to like reverse those two patterns, which would strengthen neural networks and lead to improvements in executive functioning abilities like impulse control and attention. So together, there's a lot of mixed results across studies, whether or not these are helpful. One study showed that after 3 months of neurofeedback, when it was combined with biofeedback and behavioral interventions, they had significant improvements in symptoms and executive function abilities. So that goes to show that combining interventions can be really effective. When it was just neurofeedback alone, it doesn't usually influence functional outcomes or disruptive behaviors, but it does tend to help increase inhibition and working memory more so than cognitive flexibility. So that's pretty similar to what we saw with the cognitive training as well. So there's currently 3 main types of neurofeedback training used for children with ADHD. The most common is theta beta ratio or TBR. So this is what we were talking about a second ago, where we try to decrease the theta waves, which are linked to relaxation and reduced attention, and increase beta waves. So these are in the brain's central and frontal regions. So as we know, executive functions are in your prefrontal cortex, so it's in that same area of the brain. Randomized control trials have shown that like 30 to 40 sessions of TBR can be as effective as medication in reducing ADHD symptoms, which is great, but studies don't show these symptoms lasting over time. So neurofeedback is not something that you could just do and then stop if you want the results to be last over time. Then there's also sensory motor rhythm training. This one's a little bit newer in the research with ADHD in children. But what this one does is it helps promote relaxation and attention regulation. And when paired with TBR, it's shown to also reduce hyperactivity. SMR is also great because it regulates sleep. So kids with ADHD that also have comorbid sleep problems, this one can be really effective. And then there's slow cortical potential or SCP. And this one trains the brain's slow electrical waves, which are linked to attention and motivation and cognitive control. And the goal is to help individuals regulate their brain activity, which ultimately leads to self-regulation. Currently, though, there's not a lot of standardized educational or medical guidelines, so there's a lot of inconsistencies in these across the research. While these protocols do specify the frequency in the brain region targets, a lot of clinical applications deviate from these. There's also a lot of commercialized neurofeedback programs out there, like Smart Brain, that don't use any of the scientific support for these protocols. So that kind of clouds that picture that neurofeedback maybe isn't helpful or doesn't benefit kids with ADHD, despite like the growing research that these 3 protocols could be effective. So I listed a few organizations on there, the Society of Applied Neuroscience and the International Society for Neurofeedback and Research. Those 2 organizations right now are working towards a standardization of the practice of neurofeedback. So hopefully aiming to become more effective in the future is standardizing protocols. Sweet. All right, we made it to interventions that work. So research has shown that physical activity is the best for ADHD symptom improvement. and increasing executive function abilities. While medication is still like the best treatment, combining physical activity with that has shown to be really effective. Mindfulness is also shown to be effective in reducing ADHD symptoms and increasing executive function abilities. Both of these, there's not like one standardized protocol that's best though. So these are more component based. So we're going to go through the different components of the interventions so you can know like what to look out for when you're looking at these interventions for effectiveness.
Yeah, so I'm going to start us with our mindfulness-based interventions. And then, yeah, just a little note about medication. It does tend to have the most consistent research support, and that's partially due to the ease of measurement and control as well. So we're also not saying that these other interventions aren't worthwhile or less effective, but just trying to balance, what research exists out there, how easy it is to measure and standardize, or what hasn't been standardized yet. Usually, pairing with medication is going to lead to stronger effects. When it comes to mindfulness, the research broadly, and these include the meta analyses with mindfulness, include kids and adults. They tend to either not specify demographic information, or it tends to be, as I said, like predominantly white North American, kids that are more elementary school age, and some adolescents. So these are some population considerations to keep in mind. Um, but mindfulness as a skill involves focusing on the present moment without judgment. And so this includes meditation, which is what it's most commonly known to be, movement like yoga. And ultimately, we're trying to have strengthened awareness, more integrated sense of self, regulate attention. All lovely things. When it comes to executive function abilities, those core kind of working memory, inhibition, flexibility in kids with ADHD, we do see increases in all three of those, which is pretty impressive considering that a lot of other evidence-based treatments only showed mixed effects or only for things like inhibition, but not necessarily flexibility. Um, this includes parent ratings, it includes observations, it includes data about behavior management within the home environment. Um, and they also are, so Jesse was talking about the components are what's really effective, which is true. So there are some specific protocols that exist, like treatments like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-oriented meditation, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Those have been found to be effective. But if you don't follow those specific protocols and you just include mindfulness as a component of your intervention or just a skill or something you're working on, that's also really effective. So again, I think some limitations on this is that because mindfulness is used in so many different ways and in so many different protocols, it's hard to get that consistency when you're looking at intervention types or outcomes. We are needing more research in different populations for sure. Um, so we do have a couple questions in the chat. One, I'll let Jesse do in a second. The other one is there research to support at what age to introduce medication? Um, yes and no. It's not so much the age that matters, but if you are considering medicating a child that's really young, say like 4 or 5, it probably means there's some pretty significant severity in behavior problems or impairment of functioning. And so in that case, like, yes, higher severity would respond pretty well in medication. And that, I guess, would kind of be associated with age, but it's not really age itself. So, yeah, it's more about what is the intensity of the symptoms, what are the intensity of behavior problems, how much does it affect the kid's ability to engage in different settings, what are the associated problems, right? So that's more of like the consideration, not so much age. But I do know, as we've all probably experienced, parents can be somewhat hesitant to engage in medication. There's some concerns about, yeah, long term, how does this affect their development and how will it affect, there's side effects and things like that. But I always just encourage them to have a medication evaluation to be able to have an informed discussion with their med provider about their individual risks. I also talk about how if they're uncomfortable with stimulants, there's many non-stimulant versions of ADHD medication that would just sort of approach it a different way. So I think it's always worth that discussion and it's always worth that evaluation. And that's just what I encourage parents to do. Hopefully that answers that question. Um, Jesse, there's a question in here about one of your biofeedback interventions.
Yeah. So the question is, can we apply sensory motor rhythm treatment in session without expensive tools, or does that require extensive specialized training and equipment? So basically for all of the neurofeedback interventions, they all require like the sensors and then some way to like understand how it's changing the bodily functions, right? So that would either be like through the visual or the auditory changes. So it would include like the technology and the sensors to be able to do so. Those two organizations listed are working on standardizing protocols. So SMR, if it's done like effectively, should follow like a protocol. But those organizations are great to follow up with if you're interested in starting those neurofeedback interventions.
Great. Yeah. And, thanks for submitting those questions and feel free to continue submitting them. We'll try to pause from time to time to get to those. But when it comes to mindfulness, as we were saying, components is just as helpful as any standardized protocol. The research in terms of the population that it involves kind of varies and it's more limited maybe than we would like. Things that increase the effectiveness of mindfulness is going to be parent involvement, which was a bit mirroring our previous discussion about parent management, about, what are the things that makes that parent involvement really helpful, which is about, emotional communication, practicing skills directly with kids in session or regularly, as well as in the mindfulness literature, the intensive intervention is going to be really effective as well. And by intensive, generally just meaning like more than once a week for 45 minutes. So if you meet maybe longer sessions or multiple sessions, right? You just get a bit more traction if you kind of have more upfront, which I guess could be true of most interventions, but that's just something they specifically measured as well. Maybe if you just have more dedicated time upfront, that can be useful. Um, as well. So what you might be thinking, which is something that I work when I work with parents comes up a lot, is like my child with ADHD, you want them to like sit there and meditate is what you're saying. Which yes, there's some tips and tricks we could recommend on how to actually support mindfulness skills for kids. One, if you're doing any type of exercise, whether that's like a meditation or breathing or tensing and relaxing muscles, just keep it very, very short to start. I mean, 5 to 10, maybe even shorter. Like it truly depends on where the kid is at. And then like build that over time. And we want to have heavy, heavy reinforcements, praise, rewards for effort and participation in treatment, for using skills at home. We're always reinforcing that as well. So you are going to probably combine some of these things. Like I said, some of these evidence-based principles with behavior management can be used very effectively. And it might be helpful to incorporate more movement-based or sensory-focused activities, especially for ADHD when there's like higher stimulation seeking needs. So some example activities that can be really helpful is if you do more of like mindful eating, because that kind of can be rewarding if it's something that a snack or something they really enjoy, but you take the time to really slow down and engage in all your senses. You can play the I notice game, and it's essentially taking what we might do on a typical mindfulness practice, which is like notice I'm thinking this, or I noticed that this is red, or there are four trees outside, right? But maybe vocalize it. And that way, if it's really hard for them just to like do this all internally, you can kind of take turns and they focus on what you're noticing and they can say out loud what they're noticing. And it just kind of helps them stay more participatory rather than having it be just like thought based. You can do things like coloring. That's a great mindfulness activity. The statue game, which is more about mindful movement or not movement, where you have them move around and then they have to stop and be a statue and really pay attention to like their body awareness and moving a certain way or not moving. So that's oftentimes a fun one as well. So again, I think you could be very creative with it. You can invite them to invent activities that they might enjoy. You can think about the hobbies that they have and how to just do that more mindfully. Like if they play a certain sport, which Jesse's going to get into with the physical activity, or if they are interested in art or a video game or whatever that may be, anything can be done mindfully. Um, so leaning into the child's interests is going to be a really helpful way to engage them and help build that skill. So overall outcomes are we improve the core EF skills, working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, we're reducing hyperactivity, impulsivity, we're reducing distractibility, we're improving emotional regulation. However, all of these that I just talked about haven't necessarily been directly attached to academic achievement. So again, if that's your overall outcome, these types of interventions might indirectly support those kinds of goals, but it's not going to directly target them.
All right, so now we get into physical activity. So physical activity is any bodily movement produced by the contraction of skeletal muscles that raises energy expenditure above the resting metabolic rate. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk a lot about like the dose curve response, like intensity, frequency, and duration, and also all the components of physical activity that are most important for increasing executive function abilities. So the pathways of physical activity on executive functioning are physiological changes, cognitive demand, and complex motor tasks. So the first one we'll get into is physiological changes. So when we exercise, our brain experiences several important changes that directly improve our well-being. So one major effect is the release of neurotransmitters. So that's like serotonin, dopamine, beta endorphins, and those all boost your mood and your cognitive function. Physical activity also increases your blood flow to the brain by encouraging the formation of new blood vessels, which is also known as angiogenesis, and it supports the growth of new neurons, which is neurogenesis, in the hippocampus. So as we know, the hippocampus is implicated in your learning and memory. And these processes raise levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a key protein that strengthens these brain connections, or neuroplasticity, which in turn enhances cognitive function and improves decision-making. Cognitive demand, in addition to the physiological benefits, incorporates group games with inherent cognitive demands that can further enhance executive functioning. So while like running and cycling are great and they have those physical benefits, they involve relatively low decision making and problem solving. So to maximize that cognitive engagement, we want activities that require children to like plan and adapt to changing demands and make decisions in real time. Developmental levels also crucial for this one as well. So if the demands are not age appropriate, kids can become like frustrated or bored. So for younger children, a game of like a simple game of tag might already have a high cognitive load. Whereas for older kids, you're going to have to add more complex variations. So like tag games with added rules or objectives to maintain that same level of cognitive challenge. So the last one is complex motor tasks. So when we talk about those, there's three key components. So that's coordination, strength, and endurance. And for these ones, they also have a cognitive component. So they require significant cognitive effort until they're actually mastered. So before mastery, the brain's not like in that global default or automatic mode. Instead of it's actively engaged in processing the movement or adapting and refining that motor control. So for example, simple movements like walking, like most of us don't think about walking while we're engaged in it, right? So you need something that's more complex, like a new sport or dance routine, so that you're not in that automatic default mode. So for physical activity interventions, most studies focus on frequency, intensity, and duration. The relationship between these, so for intensity, usually follows like a bell-shaped curve or quadratic relationship. So low intensity is the bottom. So you're not getting enough of that physiological change yet for it to make a difference in your executive functioning abilities. Whereas moderate intensity is shown to be the best for children with ADHD in increasing those executive function abilities. But then once you start to like hit fatigue or get into the high intensity ranges, it starts to decrease again. The way that that's measured in the literature is either through like lactate threshold is the best, but that's really hard to measure. So that's like the efficiency of aerobic metabolism and skeletal muscles. So most research uses either heart rate or your VO2 max to be able to measure that. For frequency, studies show that chronic physical activity interventions, so those are the ones that are like sustained over time, yield the greatest benefits for children with ADHD and increasing executive functioning, but also just like a single bout of exercise can also yield immediate cognitive benefits. And then duration, there's not really like a gold standard for that one. It ranges a lot. Most studies range between like 10 to 60 minutes for duration. So outcomes. So physical activity is shown to improve all three core EF skills in children with ADHD. It's also shown to reduce hyperactivity and impulsivity, improve emotion regulation, and social functioning. So the social functioning is likely due to the cognitive demand component. So like group games really incorporate building those social connections with each other. And then, as Laura mentioned, academic achievement could be an outcome, but it's not something that it's like directly targeting. So putting it all together, noodle hockey is maybe my favorite game to play with kids. So what you do is you like take a pool noodle, you split it in half. So you have two sticks, and then you set up a field or a court with four goals. So it's like in a square. So like goal, 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 goal. And the objective is for the kids to hit the ball. There's like a big ball with the noodles into one of the three goals that aren't their own. So the physiological component would be kids are not walking, but they're like not sprinting, right? They're like maintaining a pretty consistent pace throughout. So that's moderate intensity. The cognitive component would be that it's a pretty novel activity. Like most kids don't just like play noodle hockey regularly, and they have to communicate with their teammates and make quick decisions about passing and shooting and defending, which is also complex motor skills. And that added component in the difficulty in coordination and motor abilities is like a bendy pool noodle is not going to be as easy as like a traditional hockey stick would be. If you're not interested in noodle hockey, there's other sports that also include all these components. So like basketball or rock climbing or racket sports are also good examples of including all three of these.
So overall, when we think about the evidence-based principles for executive function, we want to train these skills in real-world contexts or have relational factors like with parents or with peers, with the group games, and have emotional regulation as an important component as well. The motivation of the child to engage is going to moderate any effects. So we want to be mindful of different engagement strategies, sensory supports, physical movement, and having reinforcement and reward systems for effort or engaging in skills. And then if there's interventions with the mixed research, like we talked about, it can still be helpful. It just kind of depends on what the strategies are used, if it's contextually relevant, who develops the goals, what are we trying to have as an outcome. So just more so keeping the principles in mind, we can make a lot of these interventions more effective. And as we said, the limitations are going to be that there's often a lack of diversity, although a couple of the meta-analyses that I shared in the beginning with executive function related to academic achievement was pretty diverse and longitudinal, like across development and in different areas of the world. So there are some things we can really ground into, but we just need more research in different populations. All right. We have a couple minutes for any questions, but while people are working on that, just if you're interested in more related topics, we do have on our webinar program other things that you might find interested in. And if you want to join our mailing list, you can stay up to date of any more trainings or other related events. And if you're interested in formal testing, or intervention planning, we do that as well. Let me just double check the Q&A for additional questions. There was a question about if the children with ADHD have little interest in physical activities or team-based sports, are there any tips to engage them? What do you think, Jesse?
Yeah. So the cognitive demand piece, I guess, is easiest with group games just because it automatically includes a lot more decision making and cooperation. But there's other ways to incorporate that. So like rock climbing or like more endurance type sports or like so like mountain biking, rock climbing, anything where you're still problem solving in the moment can be helpful. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a team-based sport. It just has to be something a little bit more complex than like running or cycling would be. So
Yeah. And I think you can also take the behavior principles as well of like, what about, what might be reinforcing to get them to engage in some physical activity, like, or can they combine physical activity with a hobby that they already do enjoy or with a friend? So I think there's also a lot of ways you can reinforce just the effort put in, and physical activity is just a very beneficial thing in your life, even if we all don't enjoy it all the time. It's nice to at least build that as a habit in whatever way we can. But yeah, if there's any other questions, you can feel free to connect with us. And um, thank you so much for taking your time and joining us this hour. You guys take care.